Okay, so today begins part one of a two-part section on working with databases. So we'll be working specifically with relational databases up until about, I don't know, 15 years ago or so. Pretty much when you said database, you meant relational database. And still, relational database is far and away the most popular kind of database management, but there are other kinds now, other kinds that are popular and kind of reasonable. So we're only really talking about the classical way of kind of interacting with corporate data as a relational database. What do we mean when we say relational database? In relational databases, you can make relationships between data. So you've got one set of data, another set of data over here, and they're related to each other, but that's not what relational means at all. A relation is a mathematical term for a table of data. So when we say it's relational database management, we're saying it's managing data in tables of data. That's what it means by relational database management. And so the big focus of course, database management is managing the data. And so when we talk about like the database approach, how is it that we're going to go about managing data? We say, listen, we've got some piece of software that we refer to as a database engine. Sometimes it's called a back end, but it is non-visual software. It's software that does not even have a front end, a user interface on it. It's just here to manage the data. And its jobs are dealing with data security, making sure that someone who isn't allowed to have access to the data doesn't get access to it, doesn't like bypass the whole infrastructure and go directly at the data. Data integrity, meaning that if you say this sale is for customer number 100, there really is a customer number 100. Data recovery, I'm missing a Y there. So, if we're right in the middle of updating something and someone comes by and kicks the power cord out or some kind of catastrophic failure, there's a disk failure or something, it's the database engine, the software that's responsible, that when it kind of comes back online, it can go, oh, wow, something really bad happened. We got to be able to recover from that. Data definition, in other words, kind of setting up the structure of the data manipulation, putting data into the tables, changing the data that's into the tables. And then, but the big thing that it spends the vast majority of its time doing is running queries. That's all stuff that this database engine does. In your experience, what would be the name of a database engine that you've heard of or maybe worked with? Say it again. So Access, when you say Access, everything you see is the front end, and the engine that goes with database with Access today is called ACE, the ACE engine. I'm not sure what ACE stands for. It's an acronym of some kind. But the earlier engine that came with Access was called JET, the JET engine, J-E-T, which is probably the best example of a backronym that I know of. What's a backronym? It's like thinking of a great acronym and then trying to figure out words that go with it. They're saying this is no ordinary engine. This is a JET engine. And so what did they come up with? It stood for Joint Engine Technology, which doesn't really mean anything, but that was the engine. So yeah, Access does come with the engine, but we don't ever talk about it. Today it's called the ACE engine. And you don't see it. And in fact, you can take all the tools you use in Microsoft Access as a front end and hook them up to a different back end. So other back ends you might have heard of. So the other kind of popular one by Microsoft is called Microsoft. Okay, so Azure does have a database platform. Azure is a huge collection of tools, and they do have a couple of different databases up there. They have one called Cosmos, and they have another one that's just called Azure DB, I think, but it's actually a cloud instantiation of their Microsoft SQL Server, which is their flagship database product. Oracle, as a company, has a product also called Oracle. That's a back-end server. And then a couple others that are maybe a little bit newer than either of those that we've talked about so far are MySQL, which is open source, was purchased by Oracle a decade ago or so. And then the other one that's really popular out there is called Postgres. And so, but these are all softwares. Their job is to do all this stuff to manage relational data stored in tables. This video is no longer available because the YouTube has been terminated. That's okay. I didn't want to watch the video anyway. That was just to introduce the user. I think in that video is where we have some guy from the what century are the guys in Star Trek from? 24th century, 23rd century, I don't know. Come back to the 20th century trying to figure out how to interact with our technology, and they struggle just a little bit. Anyway, So we've got the user, and the user then interacts with a different kind of software. So instead of the engine or the back end, we have the front end software or the application. So anytime you're working with the database management system and you are actually seeing something on the screen, that happens through some piece of software called the front end. So in Access, when you mentioned Access, everything you see and work with Access is called front end software. It's a general term for the part that interacts with the user. And its responsibility is to display, format, align. If you think about what's the font that this data is in, the engine doesn't care about what the font the data is in. That's the front end could say, oh, we'll put it in a nice font here. And so, again, here, then it does all these things. It might do some sorting. That's kind of the one thing that both the engine and the front end might spend time doing. But the whole purpose of the front end then is to interact with the user. So when we put these together, it looks like this. You've got the database engine that has direct control over the data. You've got the front end that does all the interaction with the user. And then these two pieces of software work with each other. So the front end's job is to figure out what does the user want after all. And then once the front end understands what the user wants, sends that request to the engine to be able to be fulfilled. So and then once the engine processes that, sends back the response or sends back a message that says, no, you asked for something that I'm not going to do because you don't have permissions to do it or whatever, or what you've asked doesn't make sense. But if it can answer the question or do whatever the request is, add some data, create a table over here, ask a question about the data, and then it sends back a response either saying, yeah, it was successful, it failed, or here's the data that you were asking for. And so the main language, which you've probably heard of, structured query language, is then the main way that we communicate between front end and back end. Now, what we're going to do here, specifically in this example today, is we're going to use then Excel as the front end. So Excel will be the software that interacts with the user and figures out what we need. It will send an SQL request off to Microsoft SQL Server, which will then deal directly with the data and then send back either the data or some kind of response. So that's kind of the high level picture. And anytime you're working with database management, regardless of whether it is relational database management or one of these newer post-relational, sometimes called NoSQL database engines, it's still the same architecture. The only question is, what is filling this role here for the server? Is it relational? If it's non-relational, like NoSQL, then it may or may not use SQL as the language to interact with. It might be something completely different. But this is still the main way that corporate data is managed. Okay, kind of any questions then on this overview about the architecture that we'll be working with today? How many of you kind of look at this presentation and you say, just kind of on a scale of 0 to 5, 5 was, I totally knew everything you just said. And then 0 is like, wow, this is brand new. So I'm seeing a bunch of zeros, some ones, some 4s and 5s, some 2s. Okay, good. I don't mind giving a little bit of review to the folks that have had a 5 in here if we're picking up folks that are feeling like they've got a 1 or a 0 there. Okay, so let's use Excel. We're going to begin with let's see, how do I minimize this? We're going to begin with this blank workbook. So I've got a blank workbook. I've already named this DB Read W22 so that when I post it, I'll be able to give you guys a good link to it. But let's start off with a couple of tools. First one, let's just see kind of what's the native way that's kind of built into Excel to do this. We're going to come to the Data tab, and I'm going to come to Get Data from Database. And no surprise, Microsoft's database is the first one listed here from Microsoft SQL Server Database. So I'll click on that, and this is going to open up a little wizard that'll get us connected on to a database. All right. Oh, I hope I remember how to do this. And actually, I've given you the information that you need in Learning Suite. If I haven't closed Learning Suite, where did it go? Oh, here we go. So in the schedule today, we should have a link. Oh, no, it's on the blog. So this redcatconnection.txt file has some information in it that'll be kind of easier to copy and paste than to type in here. And so right here where it tells us, this is VBA that we'll be using later here, but it's got the stuff that we need to connect. So we've got a server at colonialbakehouse.com. I don't know, years ago, maybe as long as a decade ago, I signed up for some kind of web host and it came with a name. All I wanted it for was for the database engine that I was going to have access to, which is SQL Server. And they said, well, what domain name do you want? And my kids at the time were running a bakery. And so I thought this would be a cute name, but we never ever used it. But it ends up, we're stuck with that name. I guess for a little more money a year, I could add a different name to it. But that's what we've got. So that's the server. And then the database is optional, but let's go ahead and plug the database in there as well. The database here is called Red Cat. It's actually a fictitious online seller of shoes, online shoe retailer, Red Cat Shoes. I don't think we need the advanced options here, timeout, some command, that's okay. And I'll say, all right, I'll say, okay. Now it's saying, listen, how are you going to authenticate? And we've got a couple of choices. One is we can authenticate with Windows. This database knows nothing about your credentials that you're logged into with on Windows right now. We could use a Microsoft account again, but my database server in the cloud knows nothing about your Microsoft account. If you're using Azure, if you're connecting onto Azure, you'd be using this Microsoft account. But we're going to come database. So database means, these are credentials that are managed by the database server itself. And again, the username and password is here on the next line down. The user is called redcat_user. And the password is Thomas_1775. Select the level these apply to. Yeah, that default should be fine there, all of this site. Let's say connect and cross our fingers that we're connecting. Actually, now as I'm remembering this probably isn't going to work so well for you because I'm not sure that the traffic on this port is going to be routed by your wireless connection. So I'm going to get here and see a bunch of tables that I can select. Are you seeing this or do you, oh, you are seeing this? Oh, excellent. The thing to realize is that, when you're kind of working on any network, oh boy, did we talk about ports in this class already? Anytime you're working with an internet protocol, you're used to thinking about a site as its domain name, right? You want to go to Microsoft.com, you think of it as Microsoft.com, but for your browser to be able to communicate with Microsoft.com, two things have to happen behind the scenes. The first one is it has to convert the domain name, Microsoft.com, to an IP address. It does that through a DNS lookup and actually gets the IP address that corresponds to that name. But the second thing is that the host name gets you to the right machine, but that machine could have lots of different services that it's running on that machine. And the port number is what specifies, which of all the services you want to talk to that machine might be waiting to listen to. So anytime you're going to a website, if you just go to http.example.com or whoever it is.com, your browser is going to go, oh, you must mean port 80. You didn't tell me what port to connect on, but the default port for HTTP traffic is port 80. If you go to https.google.com, the port it's going to use to communicate is port 443. It's the default port for that traffic. You could have a web server listening on other ports. Database servers don't listen on port 80 or 443. Microsoft SQL Server by default listens on port 1433. But the point is that on any network that you're on, it may or may not route traffic of a particular port. And especially if you're like a guest, like on some kind of guest network, it's going to route port 80 and port 443 so you can do web stuff. It's probably not going to route port 1443 because it's, you're just a guest here. Don't be accessing any database. Check your email and then go home. So yeah, so it sounds, so if you're not, is there anyone who's having an error connecting? Yeah, what wireless connection are you using? Are you using EduRoam? Yeah. So you're on EduRoam. I'm guessing people that have connected are on EduRoam, right? You're on BYU Wi-Fi and you're connected? Okay, you're on guest Wi-Fi. Did you connect? Really? That's interesting. So yeah, I don't really, so maybe it isn't the port that's the issue. It turns out, kind of interesting little bit of internet history. It was in 2001. Let's just make sure we've got the dates right here. The Slammer worm. No, it was 2003. So was a computer worm. So worm is malware, but basically, I guess I should ask the question. Do you know what a worm is? Say 0 to 5. I know what a worm is. 0, a bunch of zeros. Okay. So so malware is just any software that's written to do something bad. And a worm is a particular kind of malware that essentially tries to infect other machines. And so a machine that gets infected, its job now becomes to try to infect other machines. And that's what the Slammer worm was that was released in 2033. It took advantage of a vulnerability in Microsoft SQL Server. At the time, I think it was Microsoft SQL Server version 6, which is the most commonly installed one. Most of the folks who were using it didn't realize that their SQL Server was listening for requests coming over the web. And so they just didn't know that they were exposed to traffic outside of their network. And what this malware did was it just randomly guessed an IP address and tried to communicate with a SQL Server on that address. If it found one, if SQL Server responded, yeah, I'm listening here, it would infect that SQL Server, and that's the end, that's it. And then that machine would pick, as fast as it could, random IP addresses and try to communicate with servers on the internet to find another one that it could infect. What did it say here? Within the first 10 minutes of it being released, 75,000 SQL servers were infected. And so now you've got these machines that are just guessing IP addresses as fast as they can, trying to find out another machine to infect. And so pretty soon we had 99% of all the traffic that was being requested on the internet was these machines trying to infect more machines online. Kind of the sad thing for Microsoft is that the patch had been, yeah, it says right here, the patch had been released to fix this 6 months earlier. But most folks were like, yeah, patch smash, this is working okay for me. And so, but back in the day, these things did not update themselves, right? You had to have an administrator say, yeah, I'm going to go update my software. So, so what happened? There was so much traffic, all on port 1433, trying to find another SQL server, that you couldn't check email, you couldn't get to a website. It was like the internet was off everywhere, worldwide. You couldn't do anything. Well, if you're an internet service provider, you know, people are paying you money to get you connected to the internet. You start getting calls, you know, in a hurry. You look at your traffic and what happens? You go, wow, this is really weird. All this stuff is 1433. What's 1433 for? We don't know. We don't care. And they started putting rules into their routers to say, if it's a request on port 1433, ignore it. Just don't route it. Don't send it. Just drop it off. And as soon as enough internet service providers had those requests coming in, then the traffic, you know, doesn't get routed past the first hop, and kind of gradually the internet kind of comes back to life. But it was like, you know, it was a day without the internet. It was a weird day in 2003. But for years afterwards, you could not reliably route port 1433 traffic because, you know, if you're an internet service provider and you had just had this huge problem, you put that rule in, are you going to take that rule out? Not unless there's a really compelling reason to do so. And it's got to be pretty compelling because you got, you know, stung so hard from this. Anyway, so you can route port 1433 traffic reliably again, but it was years before you could after this particular event. So the point is that if you're not connecting, it may be because your network is not routing that particular traffic. All right, anyway, so let's see, we should be able to find in here a table. Let's just go ahead and find the customer table. Is there a table called customer? Yeah, here's customer table. I'll select this. And so again, here, this is Excel working as the front end, trying to understand what data I'm interested in. And then when I say load, it looks like it actually already has interacted with the server to bring that data back. But when I say load, it will then bring that data and put it somewhere. Here we go. So then it loads that data and brings it in. 4,000 rows of data. Okay, so that's like the native way to be able to interact with data. None of the tools that are built into Excel give you the ability to change the data on the database, right? It sees Excel as a consumer of data, not as something that we're going to change. And I just said that, and that used to be true. Is it still true? I'm not sure. They might have added some things that let us change the data, but I'm not aware of what they are. Okay, so that's kind of one way that we can interact with that. If we, and we won't go ahead and do this one all the way out. But actually, do I have any Mac users here in class today who are working on the Mac? Is the Mac version? It turns out that pretty recently, the Mac version of Excel got a really great tool for working with SQL Server. So it's easy to specify the query that you want, like not just do a table like we did here, but show only the customers in California and so forth. And I think it's pretty similar to what we just went through, but the truth is the tools on the Mac are a little bit better for working with SQL Server, at least at the beginning level. Let me just kind of preview to one other tool here, even though we're not going to use it. So get data from database, and it's called Microsoft Query. Where did it go? It's not from file, from other sources. Microsoft Query, is it here? Yeah, from Microsoft Query. So this one, I may bring up the first window, but it will let us connect on to kind of an arbitrary database, and then also not just pick a table, but specify a query to run as well. And I thought I clicked on that. I'm not sure where it went. But anyway, the point is there's lots of tools here. In fact, if we look at get data from database, we've got IBM, Oracle, MySQL, Postgres. So there's a lot of different databases to choose from kind of built in here. All right, let me kind of introduce you to another tool using this to consume data. And that is, if you come to Insert, and there's an add-on that you can get, a free add-on that will let you work with SQL Server and some other databases. We'll choose Get or Get Add-ins. And let me just search for query. And this second one here, the Atlas Query Processor, is actually an add-in that I wrote. You can say add and continue, it's free. It gives you a little tool over here that allows you to access my data now. Here, select star from customer. And this actually will run that same query against that same database that we just connected onto. And that will bring back then that set of records. But the nice thing here is that you can specify the query that you want. So I can say, add a where clause. If you had some experience with structured query language, WH, where state equals California, then that will bring back just the customers from California. What do we got? 100 or so. Oh, I'm probably truncated at 100 records. So let me not have that limit on there and run that query again. So this tool was actually built to help teach people about structured query language, which is why the query kind of stays up here available for you to modify and change to see what it might do. We have 4,000 customers and 300 of them are from the state of California. If you're working with, instead of SQL Server, but if you're working with Airtable or data.world, then this tool will connect onto those data sources as well. In fact, if we go to SQL Server, you can see here that not just the demo database that we connected on, but you could supply that same information, username, password, server. The port defaults to 1433, the database, and that would let you connect on to an arbitrary SQL Server that's available, accessible from the web to be able to pull data in. Any questions there? Okay, it should come as no surprise that the main thing that we're going to do to connect onto a database is going to be through VBA. So let's go ahead and get to our VBA editor and insert a module. And then I'm just going to copy this DB1 sub procedure that, again, you'll find on today's day from the blog that we're using to organize the data for the course. And it's just this redcat connection.txt. I'll bring that sub procedure in here. Now, we've worked with some different kinds of objects in VBA. We've created objects like references to a worksheet, to a range, to a chart, to some other things that I can't think of just at the moment. But now we're going to connect onto a database, but there's a difference between connecting onto a database and connecting onto all those other things. All those other objects that we've worked with have been native to Excel. They've been part of Excel. And so those are just readily available, part of the VBA language. You can get at them without having to do anything fancy. But our database, to be able to connect with the database engine, we're going to say, no. Now we've got to reach out and bring in an object from the operating system, something that's not just a part of Excel. And the way we do that is what we see in this first comment under here. We have to add a reference to a particular library. Let me show you how to do that. And it's actually the second line that shows us how to do that. So I'm going to come up here to Tools, and then I'm going to choose References. This is going to bring up a list of kind of other things that I could, kind of other functionality that I can use right here in VBA. Some of these things, like the one we'll be using today, the database, is like just a part of the Windows operating system. So if you're on a Windows machine, it's just there. Some of this other stuff depends on what you have installed. I mean, I look here, the Acrobat Access 3.0 type library. I don't know what that's for, but apparently it has something to do with Adobe Acrobat. What are some of the other interesting ones here? Adobe Photoshop Object Library. Apparently, I could make a reference to the Adobe Photoshop Object Library, and I could programmatically from VBA interact with that library. I'm not sure what I might do with it. But it's built here with exposure to be able to work with VBA. We're going to come all the way down to, what was it? We're going to be looking for the Microsoft ActiveX data something. So let's go down and find Microsoft. Microsoft ActiveX Data Objects Library. There's a bunch to choose from, 2, 2.1, 2.5, 6, 7, and then we jump to 6.1. That looks like the most, like the highest one. I'll choose the highest one that I have here. The truth is, any of these, even going all the way back to 2.0, would do for what we're doing today. And I don't even know the difference. Like, what have they added into this thing from 2.0 to 6.1? I don't know. But the basic stuff is going to be in all of them. Make sure that you actually checked the box, not just clicked it and made it blue, but check the box by it. And then we'll say, okay. And so that is going to give us access to these objects. So the ADODB is an Active Data Object Database connection. So there's kind of two things that we have to work with here. We're going to have to, number one, get connected to the server. And then number two, we've got a different object that's going to deal with the set of records that we're asking it to give to us. And so we can see here that we've got the connection object and we've got a record set object. And we've declared variable CN for the connection object. CS is just going to be a string. That's going to be the information we need to be able to get connected with our connection. SQL is going to be a string that we use to specify the structured query language that we're using here. And then the record set, RS, will be the record set that allows us to deal with the records that come back. Okay, so again, I've got this one configured to be able to work with that Microsoft SQL Server that's out there at the web host that I contracted with. So here, we're just saying we're setting up a string. This is called a connection string. And there are connection strings. There are lots of different connection strings. Connection, TRINGS, is it .com? There's a whole website that's just like, what database do you want to get connected to? I don't know, how about Informix? They say, great, we can give you all kinds of different ways to connect with Informix. So here's the connection string that you would use to connect with Informix. Whatever kind of database you want, there's a connection string to get you connected. And this is the one that we use to get connected onto SQL Server. We're going to tell it, we're telling it, hey, what is the driver? Now you've got to have the driver installed. So the driver is a piece of software that is installed on the machine that says, yeah, I know how to work with that. I know how to work with that database. We're using SQL Server because it is installed by default on your Windows machine. You don't have to do any installation. If you're going to interact with an Oracle database, step one would be, I got to download the Oracle driver. Actually, Windows might come with an Oracle driver, but it's not a very good one. But then there are kind of other connections that you could use. So like step one is getting the driver installed. We've got this driver installed and it's called the SQL Server driver. It then needs to know what database we're connecting onto. Remember, we specified the database when we made the connection through the front end. And it needs to know the server that it's talking to. And so that's that same colonialbakehouse.com. And so this is the information that we need to be able to identify the server. And then our next line is going to use that connection object, the active data objects database connection object. And we're going to call the open method. We're passing it the connection string that we just defined here. So in this one parameter, we're telling it the driver of the database, the server, and potentially other things. Like this is just the minimum need 3 things we need to have it connected. We can kind of tell it, some other configurational things as a part of this connection string as well. And then we give it the username and the password. And so in fact, I'm going to run right to that point. So let me come here and put a stop in my code and then run this. If I get here without an error, huzzah, I have made a connection to that database. I've got an open channel of communication to that database. How many of you are trying to do this along and succeeded? Yeah. Anyone trying to do it along and didn't get here without an error or had an error? No? Okay. All right. And so if I was doing something to change the data, which we're going to do on Wednesday, if I was doing something to change the data, then I'm ready to use it. My connection object has an execute method that I can just say, here's the statement that I want you to change. But what we're doing today is we're pulling data back. And so the next thing that we're configuring is our structured query language statement. Show me, I'm expecting you all have some exposure to structured query language, but show me on 0 to 5 how comfortable you are with structured query language. I'm seeing some zeros. Does that mean no exposure to it at all? Oh, okay. I'm seeing some 1. That means IS 201 was your last exposure to, or something was a while ago. Oh, okay. So seeing some 2s and some 0s. Okay. So let's just take a look at structured query language just for a minute, and maybe I can come back here to this connection. Come back here to demo. I think I can zoom in here, and this should let me, oh, it doesn't let me change the size. Pity. Okay, so this is a structured query language statement. And this is like the standard language for working with relational database management systems. And the truth is, every single database engine has their own implementation of structured query language. And so the standard gets you like 80% of the way there, but then when you start doing kind of fancy things, or I should say fancier things, and it's just restricting on values and so forth, then it's going to be different from database platform to database platform. For example, the way you work with dates is often not the same from one database engine to another. So how do you find out, what is the month of a given date? That might be different. But in this case, we're saying select. The select clause of the select statement just says which columns you want to see. And so here, by saying star, I'm saying I want to see them all, but I could specifically say the ones that I want here. So instead of all of them, maybe I just want first name and last name. So let me get rid of the star, and I'll come in here with first name, comma, last name. And I'll run that query. And now I've got just those two columns. So the select portion says, which columns do you want to see? The from clause then says, which table do you want to see? So you have to know something about which tables are available to you. And so there's one here called customer. There's one called sale. You get rid of the where clause for a moment. And because I'm not really sure which columns are in sale. I will come here and just put the star again. So the sale says happen on a particular date for a particular customer, amount of tax, and then amount of shipping. Seems like there's a sale item table that's going to show me the details about, I don't need maximum for this one, just stop this at 100 records. Sale, maybe there's no underscore in this database. So here's where we find out which products for a given sale has a given product, the size, these are shoes, and so these are all shoe sizes here. Don't really want to move that data around. And it has the price and the quantity. Why those prices are like to 4 decimal points, I don't know, but that's what those prices are. So, if you're working with a database, you got to have some idea about what tables are out there. And by the way, I guess I should maybe go kind of one step philosophically higher as to why we should even be doing this. You're a finance major. Why do you need to be accessing the database directly? Here's the reason. You get hired and your boss says, look, here's some data that we need to analyze. It's in our, it's in the promotions table. It's all the promotions that are kind of in this range that deal with this particular set of customers. Get that data and we'll start working with it. Well, you don't know how to get that data. So you call up the guys at the Office of Information Technology. Hey, I need this data. And they say, yeah, send it to us in an email because we need all the details. Great. So you send them an email. What happens to the first request that you send? Do you know yet? They ignore the first request that you sent. Why do they ignore it? They really want to see if you're serious. Because if you really need this data, you're going to ask again. But as a new employee, you don't realize that's the way it works around here. And so you wait. Well, maybe they're busy. I don't want to sound pushy. And so you've lost 3 days, before they even take your request seriously. And then you finally, hey, email them again. Hey, what's the status on this? Oh, and then they respond to you. Okay, here's what we need. You got to tell us this, this, and this, but you don't know. And so you go figure it out. You talk to your boss and tells you, you find it. And you finally send it back to them. This is what we need. And then they say, great, we'll get on it. And they might get it. They might not. You might have to remind them again. Eventually, they're going to give you the data that you asked for. Only once you start going over it, what's the problem? It's not the data you asked for. It really isn't. It's close, but it isn't. So you go back and say, no. What I need is this. Another couple of days go by, and then you finally get it. This is what I asked for. And at that point, you realize what? Well, not the deadline, maybe it's come and gone by now, I don't know. But by that time, you realize, oh, I didn't really ask for the right thing. They finally gave me what I asked for, but now seeing what I asked for, I realize, no, I need something else. Do you think this is a joke? This is not a joke. This is the way it works, unfortunately. And so it's going to take some doing to say, listen, will you just please give me the access credentials and I will ask the questions myself. Now your turnaround time is a matter of seconds after you specify the question before you find out, oh, that isn't what I need. And you can kind of tune back and forth much more quickly. And so, yeah, this is the difference. Kind of having these skills is the difference between you answering that boss's question in a day or two versus 2 weeks and he's wondering, why haven't you done that analysis yet? Because getting the data is a big part. And so having some exposure to structured query language, I really recommend it, especially now that you've got some code-based tools to be able to put that to use and actually pull data to be useful with it. Okay, let me go back to the sale table. And let's say that we're interested only in sales that happened in particular months. So maybe we're like looking for 20. I think this data starts in 2013 and goes to, I don't know, maybe 2017 or something. So I'm going to add a where clause on here. The select clause tells me which columns I want to see. The where clause tells me which rows I want to see. And so here I'm going to put in something that will evaluate for true or false for each row. So in this case, I'm going to say I'm only interested, let's say I'm interested in June of 2014 sales. So I'm going to say where the month of my sale date is equal to 6. And so now, yeah, that's 6 of 2014. I've only got 100 records coming back. Let me take that up to 1,000. And then I'm getting some in 2015. So I'll lower that down to a year. So I'll put an and clause in here, and the and is going to work really similar to how and works in VBA. And the year of my sale date is equal to 2014. And so I can restrict down to the columns that I want. Now, maybe we're also only interested in sales that happen to customers who live in California. And so really can't make that bigger. So let me write this query somewhere that we can see it a little bit better. So select star from sale, where this is true. But let me come in here then and say, I want to join a couple of tables together. This is where it starts to get a little bit more complex. But you can see here, I've got a customer ID. What that says is for this sale, it belongs to a particular customer ID. So I can go look up that 10941 and find out which customer has that ID, and I can know the customer that it's from. Well, one of the powerful things about structured query language is to be able to say, you know what, just join those two data sets together, like bring in all the information for customer 10941 on this record, bring in all the information from this customer here to make a larger table with all the data that I'm after. And that's what the join clause does. From sale, join customer on the sales sale ID is equal to the customer sale ID. I'm sorry, it's the sales customer ID is equal to the customer's customer ID. Then we're interested where the month is that, and the year is this, and the state is equal to California. And the string literal identifier in SQL is a single quote, whereas it's a double quote in VBA. So I have strings in SQL, it's a single quote, and the state is equal to California. So now this should give me all the information for both from the sale and the customer table for sales that happened in June of 2014, where the state is California. Can run that, and there it is, not that many. So we've got what, 19 or 17 different sales here in that period from customers in California. Whew. So that's like a really quick introduction to structured query language. Could I join another table onto this? Sure. Yeah, just another join clause, another table, and then which columns they join on. Okay. Can I put the join what? Oh, so if I was going to have another join, say I was going to join, I wanted to actually get to it's two more joins to get to the product. But if I wanted to get to the quantity as here, then I could join to, what was it, sale item. In fact, it might be helpful to look at the schema here. So for this particular database, let's just take a look at it. I happen to publish a few of these on a blog called db-schema.blogspot.com. And Red Cat Shoes here will kind of show us this. So right now what we've done is we've joined the customer table to the sale table where the customer ID and the customer is equal to the customer ID in the sale. So we can see from this picture that the sale item table is connected based on the sale ID. So I could join onto that table that way, join sale item on the sale items sale ID. Is equal to the sales sale ID. So I've added in another table, and you can keep adding to your heart's content. Thank you. Need a mouse trap for that mouse. Almost made a break for it. So what should that bring in? That should bring in the item size, the quantity, as well as the price that was paid for that. Oh, hey, it got bigger by itself. That's pretty good. So now if I look out here, I'm seeing the product size price. I wanted to actually see the product, one more join can get me to the product table. I can see the name of the product that was purchased there as well. It seems like a little strange thing to do to have to join all these tables together, but the reason in relational databases, the reason that the data is split out into those separate tables is so it helps to make sure that the data is, we don't have redundancy in the data, so that we don't have, like, over here it says the price of that product is one thing and somewhere else it says it's something else. There's only one place for me to record the price of the product. And so it helps to keep our data, help the data to have integrity. And we kind of pay the price for that when it's time to extract the data out, because we have to join it back together. Okay. So let's just go ahead and, well, I guess we'll use a simpler example here because you can't just copy and paste what I have already. And so what we've got here is select star from customer, right? That's the structured query language statement that we're asking the server to process for us. So maybe I'll just step through to there. So that will just, that line that just executed here only put that string into the SQL variable. Now this is a strange thing because this is a statement that's going to be interpreted somewhere. Some computer's got to figure out what that means, but it's not VBA. VBA knows nothing about the customer table. VBA knows nothing about the select class. Select doesn't mean anything to VBA. And so what I've done is I've taken this statement that I want my database server to understand, and I've just put it as a string, right? By putting this inside double quotes, I'm telling VBA, don't try to understand this. Just keep track of these characters. And then here is where I'm going to send that query, that structured query language statement, using this connection that we already established. And we're going to open a record set with that. So I'll go ahead and execute that line. If I don't get an error, and that means great, it talked to the database and it got the first record. Turns out the record set object itself, it kind of sounds like it's got the whole set of records, but it doesn't. It has just the first record. And so now I could come up here to my immediate window and I can even, I can ask that record set, what are the column names? So I can say rs.fields.names, fields.name. Oh no, fields, I got to tell it which field I want. Field number 0. So it's going to be a 0-based collection for my fields. And then I can ask for the name. That tells me that's customer ID. What's field number 1? First name. Field number 2, last name. So actually the record set knows about the names for these fields. Well, that's probably the first thing that I want to do is I want to print onto my active sheet. Let me give myself a new active sheet here. I want to start by putting the names of the fields right here in the first row. Let's just go ahead and do that. So here I'm going to, before I close the record set, I'm going to work with it up here. And let me just dim, why don't we call it C as an integer. And then we're going to just do a for loop. For C equals 0 to rs.fields.count. Oops. So if there are 10 fields, that's going to be 10, but I want my indices to go from 0 to 9. So I'll subtract 1 off of this. And I've got now a loop that's going to take C across the set of indices I need to refer to those column names. So on my active sheet, I'm just going to put this data right there. So what am I going to say? Cells, row number 1, column number, why don't we do C plus 1, because that C is going to be referring to the field that I'm after. So this will be row 1, column 1, dot value is equal to the name of the field at the number C position. So that should increment C, which will control both the column that I'm writing to as well as the field that I'm reading from. So I think if I run that, it should put those names across, and it shouldn't take that long. Oh, you know what? I didn't have a breakpoint in here, so I think it ran through. So I think it worked okay. Yeah, so it put the names in, but I lost my code, so I'm gonna have to run it again to bring it back. That's okay. But I'll just move my stop down to here, and I'll run this again. Okay, so I've got the column names in place. Now I'd like to get the data. Well, let's see what we have to do to work with a set of records. This is going to take a different loop. This is going to be a do loop. So let me do while, no, let me do until something. We'll come back and fix that in a minute. My loop in here. Loop. Put my do events in. Okay, it turns out my record set can tell me if it's reached the end of the record. I mentioned that my record set only actually has access to one record at a time. So up here, instead of doing the name of field number 2, I can ask for the value. And I think field number 2 was the last name. So I should see someone's last name here. Do until. You just take off that clause so I can run this in the immediate window. So the first record that comes back, the last name is Dominic. What's the first name? First name is James. So my record set doesn't bring back all the records because remember, you've got database that might have millions of records. You just might not be able to fit all that data even into memory on your computer. And so it brings back one at a time. And so we'll have to tell it, okay, I'm done with that record, move on to the next one. And this record set can tell me if it's reached the end of the record set yet. So I'm going to do until rs and til until rs.eof, short for end of file. End of file is a Boolean property that's just going to be false until we've read the last record. It's actually until we've read past the last record, until we have tried to read past it, it'll be false. I'm not at the end of the file until I've tried to read a record that doesn't exist. Okay, so what is EOF right now? Well, there's like 4,000 of them. And so far, I've only seen the first one. So EOF just rs.eof is false. rs.eof is false. We're not at the end of the file yet. So this is going to be true. This is going to execute until this is true. So as long as it's false, we'll keep going. What am I going to do? Well, actually, I'm going to do something really similar here. I'm just going to copy this loop from doing all of the column names, and I'll use that same loop for putting in the data. But instead of looking at the name, I now want to see the value. Problem is, right now, I'm only writing onto row number 1. So let me declare another variable here. Dim r as a long integer and set r equal to 2. And then we'll write to the rth row. I'm going to bring my code back up to pick up the r equals 2. And I'll put a breakpoint on a loop. And that should run the first time through. And let's just see if it did. So it's put then all of those values right onto here. Right, if I run it again, I better be incrementing r in here. R equals r plus 1. And I'm writing the same value over and over again. And that's because I haven't told the record set to move on to the next record. And so I'll increment r, and then I will call the move next method. So rs.move next. And that will then tell the record set to move on to the next record. So now I'm getting a record, telling the record set to get the next one, and bringing that data right in here. So maybe I'll stop this, take my breakpoint off, and then run that again. And that should bring on all 4,400 and some odd records. Pretty good. Okay, questions here? Show me how comfortable you are with the code that we've written so far, 0 to 5. Seen a 4 pretty quickly, some 2s, some 5s in there. Okay. Next thing I'd like to do is I would like to make this actually kind of look like a table. Well, let's make it actually auto fit and then look like a table. I don't remember how to write that code. So I'm going to record myself doing that. It's not terrible code, so you can either record yourself and copy it like I'm doing, or you can just type it after we see it here. I'll just record it. Macro 1's a fine name, that's fine. And so let me just press Control Star to select my data. And auto fit. Can I just double click this? What auto fit? Oh, I just did it to one column. That's okay. That'll give me the auto fit statement. And then I want to say insert table. And it has headers. That's right. We'll say okay. That makes it into a table. And I'll stop recording. Come over to module 2 and let's see what we created here. So it looks like we've got here auto fit. That's great. In fact, let me just kind of copy everything from the auto fit one back over. And we've got a lot of reduction to do on this code. So don't, if you're planning on typing this, don't start typing yet. Okay, so after we put the data in here, instead of saying column CC, let me just say range A1 dot current region. So that'll say from A1, all the contiguous data, the entire column of that auto fit. That's going to auto fit my data for me. Cut copy mode false, we don't need. Okay, active sheet.listObjects.add source. I think the range here again should be my current, whoops, that's current region. Again, that'll be my current region is going to be the data set. So instead of being hard coded, and the yes means we have headers. I don't think we're going to need the name. I think it'll give it a name just fine by itself. So let me get rid of the name, which means I'm not doing anything with the results of this function. So no parentheses around the arguments. And so that should make it so that it brings the data in, auto fits it, and then formats it like a table. I'm going to go ahead and make a new sheet to work on. Get rid of my stop here. RS close just says, hey, we're done with this record set, free up the memory from that record set. And connection close says we're done with that connection, free up that memory as well. Of course, having a connection open, I could do like multiple different record sets kind of at the same time or in sequence and so forth. Okay, so I run this, it should pull that data and bring it back onto that sheet. Yeah, I'm surprised. It looked like it kind of wasn't finished running when I first went back. So maybe the code was still going, I'm not sure. It does take a little while to iterate across these records and put those records out one at a time. But now it's given me a pretty good looking set of data. Questions? You don't need to do this, but let's just do it for, I'm just going to do it for kicks. I'm going to take this query that we wrote. It's got 3 tables joined together. And let me just drop that in for the SQL statement. Oh, this is a little bit problematic because in VBA, there's no multi-line string. So I'm going to make this onto fewer lines. In fact, maybe I'll make it on fewer lines over here. Maybe we'll just make it on one big line. Oh, it is word wrapping. Okay, I think that's just one statement now. It's kind of an ugly way to look at a select statement. So I'll comment out this one. It would be okay to leave it there because it would just set that variable and then right over the top of with this one. I'll come to a new page and I'll run my code again. And then we'll see then that it's brought in all of that sale data. So it's just, all the code here is exactly the same, except I've given it a different instruction on which set of records I want to come back with. Questions? So this is using VBA to interact with a database server somewhere out there on the internet or somewhere in the corporate infrastructure. As long as I can get access to that database, we're in pretty good shape. Now, sometimes you do want to iterate across those records in memory. So in other words, I don't want to display them to the user. All I want to do is work with them until I find something that I'm particularly looking for, and then maybe use that customer ID that's here somewhere. Use the customer ID to make a request to something on my some web server that allows me to be able to get information, through not through a database request, but request that data from a web server. That's kind of our next major module, is to see how can we automate like Chrome to do automatic web requests. And so maybe what we have to do is make a request to the database to get the customers that we need, and then take those customer IDs one at a time and take them off to some Salesforce server or something to say, all right, we now need to get some other information that's only here in Salesforce about these customers and bring that in to build the report that we're trying to build. So in that case, you probably don't even want to ever display this data, right? You're just pulling it in and then processing it. But if what you're trying to do is actually display the data, there's a much faster way than going through it record by record. So let's do that as our last example then for today. So I'm going to go ahead and take this procedure that we have here, and I'm going to copy the whole thing. We'll make it, this is DB1. Let me make another one called DB2. And this one is going to do everything exactly the same, except this part where we're putting out those records row by row. So this is here as an example of, if I'm going to go through the records one at a time. But if all I want to do is put them on the sheet, turns out there's a pretty good way to do that. I'm going to delete that from this example. And let's just set this to range beginning in A2. At this point, we've already written the column names onto row 1. And so now in the first column of row 2, I'm going to call a method of the range object, which is copy from record set. This range knows how to work with a set of records, the same kind of set of records that we've created with our RS object that we've opened here. All I have to do then is give it the record set that I want to copy from. And the parentheses are not needed here. So I'm not doing anything with the result set. I'm not even sure that copy from record set returns anything. But I'm telling it, this is the record set that I want to process. That's the method I'm sending it to. By the way, we're going to put the results in A2. So now, with that one line, I should be able to get that same set of records back. And if I'm dealing with like thousands and thousands and thousands of records, this will be dramatically faster. I wonder if we can actually tell the difference in the time that it takes. That happens so fast, I'm afraid that we're going to have sub-second differences. Try the other one. Let me do DB1 and see if we can sense that it takes longer. You can kind of see it scan across, whereas DB2, they just pop in. Oh, and we've only got 40 records anyway. So we're going to take off the where clause and get back a bunch more records, and we'd see speed there. Okay, we've got a little more time. Is there a question that I can answer, or do you want to tackle something else here in terms of reading data from databases? Question, go ahead.
Talked about this last week. You said this today's lesson would be about help us start our database project. How much of a database project can start like 10%?
So yeah, so the question is, what have you given us here that's going to be relevant to the database project? And so all of this, what we're doing here, this whole approach saying we're going to need a connection object, a connection string, we're going to need a structured query language statement. That's all going to be relevant to us. Here, our example today is working with Microsoft SQL Server, kind of like corporate database. The truth is, if I try to have you write queries against my SQL Server in the cloud, someone's going to write a loop that doesn't change, right? And it's going to try to write 10,000, 10 million, 100 million records to my database. So I'm not giving you permissions to write to my database. Instead, when you're doing the writing, you're going to write to a Microsoft Access database, which means what's the difference? Different connection string. It's one of the beauties of working here is that once you get the connection string, kind of the rest of it is the same. So this has got some of the groundwork that you need, but you're not really ready to even make the request to the database because you don't know the connection string yet. So on Wednesday, we're going to see how do we actually insert data. We'll definitely insert into a Microsoft Access database. You'll see the connection string and how that works. You'll see how we do a statement that's not retrieving data back, but how do we write a structured query language statement that pushes data into the database? And so this is giving you some of the stuff, but I wouldn't start working on it yet. So Wednesday is where you're going to get the real, like you're going to go, okay, this is close to what we have to do. Other questions? All right, folks, thanks for coming. We will see you on Wednesday for part 2 of working with databases. I guess before I save this, I'm going to get rid of a bunch of these sheets. All right. Thanks, Sam. See you later. Yeah.